as a sociologist, I have always been a little skeptical of the discipline of psychology. And I have, till I met Karen, I was always sort of doubtful about psychology's ability to deal with institutional racism. And Karen said, here are 5 basic readings that you can do that will turn you around. And she was correct. So I became, Karen really introduced me to the kinds of approaches in clinical psychology, which is her specialty, that open our eyes up and open our analysis up from a psychological perspective to various dimensions of racism. And her work has been very focused on Asian American communities. She has, we all know that the model minority myth has had immense psychological impacts on Asian Americans, and we are also very poorly, our needs are very poorly met in terms of mental health. These are issues that Karen addresses very directly. And she also has trained her students, her PhD students, to work with Asian American communities in Boston. And as you know, that Boston and its surrounding areas have very large Southeast Asian communities that have been multiply traumatized. Her students work with these communities, and the work that they do is really, really crucial and important. And she, along with doing this very important research, because, and Karen is one of the few psychologists who fill a huge gap in the literature, she also mentors her graduate students into publishing with her and doing, training as clinical psychologists, which is a very long and grueling training, I believe. So it is no wonder that in 2012 she won the Joan H. Liam Award for Outstanding Doctoral Mentoring. She has also won multiple awards for her research on social justice and anti-racist therapy and education. She's won the Asian American Psychological Association Distinguished Contribution Award in 2013, that was last year. And that year in 2013 she was also given the award for Asian American Pacific Islander women, the White House Champion of Change. So her work has been nationally recognized. Karen's affiliation is, she's a professor of psychology and Asian American studies at the University of Massachusetts in Boston. And she is a very, very enthusiastic member of the Asian American Studies program there. I hear about her from my colleagues who are in that program all the time. So I'm very happy that you're here, Karen, to spend your sabbatical, and welcome back.
Thank you for having me. I have way too much to say, so I'm going to talk really fast, and I'm going to skim over a bunch of things, and then we can hopefully have some time at the end where we can come back. But I'm going to try to talk about research findings, but also talking about how the discussion of teaching and how those things integrate for me. So training students to conduct research while also empowering them to resist racism. And talk a little bit about that discrepancy between psych and Asian American studies that Manisha has overcome. But I actually want to start with, let's see. All right, I want to start with acknowledgements. So thank you to Ethnic Studies for hosting me, and especially to Manisha, who has been a great friend and colleague. So this isn't working for me, and I'm hoping someone could help me. I can get this to work. Okay, I can do that. Good. All right. All right. I can do it that way. All right. Sorry about that. Great. I'd like to start with thank yous.
Yeah, you can also tap.
All right. That's pretty good.
Tap the screen.
And Asian American Studies at UMass, particularly Peter Kyung, who has been a great support to me, My colleagues in psychology and clinical psychology, especially Steve Schwartz, Joan Lean, and Liz Romer, the Institute for Asian American Studies, the many graduate and undergraduate students who have contributed to this work, especially Grace Kim Watanabe, Feng Nguyen, Stephanie Day, John Tawa, Chuck Liu, Fanny Ng, Ruth Soy, Tracy Ciola, David Ree, Mike Som, and Rathana Lim. And the students are amazing. I mean, students just are constantly amazing me, like our undergraduate and our graduate students, and what they're capable of and what they will rise to. And so in many ways, I feel like this talk is really kind of a tribute to the students who are just terrific. And the students, faculty, and staff who shared their experiences with us during the research projects that I'm going to be telling you about. So I'm going to talk start with a little bit about context. So psychology and Asian American studies. When I came to UMass and took this position, in my interview, I had somebody say, "I don't know that this is going to work." And I was like, "Oh, well, I don't know what to say to that." And that year, I actually went to the Asian American Psych Association conference, I think it was that year, and saw a panel on the connections between Asian American studies and psychology, in which somebody said, "This is a terrible idea, never take a job like this." I was like, oh my God. But I think they're wrong. I mean, I really think they're wrong. Because, yes, it is totally true that, like, mainstream psych and kind of the core of what Asian American studies has become, you know, that 30 years later, you know, kind of thing, are different. And they don't have a lot of overlap, right? Psychology tries to be objective and post-positivist and quantitative and all of these things that Asian American studies is rightfully super skeptical about, right? And Asian American studies, much as we would like to be activists and empowering for students and that kind of thing, there is an ongoing discourse in the area that we have become academic, that we have become ivory tower. You know, I know that I have gone to Asian American Studies associations, and like we did a roundtable on psychology and Asian American studies. We had people come and cry and say, "I have never felt connected in Asian American studies. I have always felt like there was so much jargon, I couldn't follow what was being said." Right? So it's like, there are these two things, and they're very, very different. And yet, there is this overlap in the middle space. There is a group of critical psychologists that include critical race theory and really aim to empower and address racism. And there is a group of really community-based, people-oriented, on-the-ground Asian American studies, ethnic studies groups. And why not bring them together, right? So this is like that space that I get really, really excited about. That kind of individual with the community, that it's not one or the other, but how do you constantly be in that space in between? The personal is political, but the political is also personal. So always having to kind of loop it back. And kind of the work I'm going to be talking about today has a big piece of how do we, say in Asian American studies or with the kinds of agendas that we share in this room, how do we live what we preach? How do we bring it into what we teach, what we publish, all of those kinds of pieces? So that's kind of where I'm coming from in my context, and the fact that, yeah, I know that there are these broader, bigger national contexts that don't want to talk to each other, but we don't have to reify that, right? Just like we don't necessarily have to reify the university and community split, right? So Kenyon Chan in 2008, I forget, in the Journal of Asian American Studies wrote an article called Rethinking the Asian American Studies Project, Bridging the Divide Between Campus and Community. Mm-hmm. And he makes an argument that it's really outdated to say that this is not connected. And I think that's particularly true for universities like mine at UMass and yours here, that our students, it's not like we have an ivory tower with students who are disconnected from the community. Our students are the community, right? And so we can bring this together, and then we can kind of think about students as community members, and think about the community that we create and that we model for them within the university in terms of skills that they can bring into other spaces. So basic kind of this idea that even though, at some level I think you have to be aware that it might be a sellout to say, oh, we're going to focus on the community of the university. And then we never think beyond that, okay? But it doesn't have to be a sellout. It can actually be a space where you teach students to be politically engaged, to be engaged in resisting structural oppression through modeling it in this space where we as academics, as professors in this space, have more power and more say to make space for that to happen for them, right? So I'm thinking a lot, like I said, about how do we practice what we preach and how do we bring it into teaching and research and service, and can we make those things come together so that it's not like there's teaching and there's research and there's service, but there's teaching, research, and service all in an interwoven network that promotes certain kinds of social justice values that are rooted in Asian American studies, values about kind of resisting oppression and resisting and using education as emancipatory. Right? So to do that well, I think you have to know the context that you're working in. In other words, you have to be rooted in where you are. Right? So the work I'm going to be talking about is rooted in Boston. Boston's really different, really different than Hawaii. And I just want to kind of say, yeah, Boston's really different. So there's no way that kind of it's going to come whole hog into this space. The politicization of Asian Americans in Boston is a totally different process than here, where the numbers are so different, where the history is so different. So just kind of saying, I recognize it has to be contextual, so I'm not at all saying it'll just transfer over. Okay. So that's kind of basics. I'll do this. I'm gonna talk just about that fast about a program of research that has been going on for 10 years, and I'm gonna try to give you a little bit of flavor about what our findings are, but also, in other words, findings meaning traditional, like what is the knowledge gained, right, the results, but also what the outcomes are, meaning how does it affect students, how does it affect the university, how does the process lead to something that is about resisting racism or empowerment in the students, and then applying the findings so that it goes broader than just knowledge production in the ivory tower. Okay. And the projects I'm going to talk about are a needs assessment for Asian American students, a qualitative grounded theory study exploring the impacts of Asian American studies, a study that really aimed to assess the mental health correlates for Asian American studies enrollers and the mental health effects of taking Asian American studies classes for Asian American students. And if we have time, we'll talk about that. I don't think we're going to, but I'd love to. Okay. So these are the goals that I bring to this whole arena. Okay. So increasing knowledge regarding the complex lived experiences of Asian American students. And if you look at this, they're not that different than the goals of Asian American studies, right? Exploring and promoting ways to support Asian American students, both in recommendations from research so that it affects education broadly, but also in the current context in the moment. Asian American students that are in my classroom, that are in the university and not in my classroom. Addressing the underrepresentation of Asian Americans as educational and social science researchers through using the students as researchers model, hooking them with the research bug so they go out and do amazing things. And then impacting the policies and practices within the university itself. Okay. So starting with the needs assessment. We really started with this question, what are the needs and experiences of Asian American students at UMass Boston? Year 2, I'm at UMass Boston, a little bit of context here. I don't teach anything, I've never taken anything I currently teach. And I started teaching in Asian American Studies, never having taken an Asian American Studies class, ever. So there was like this really steep learning curve for me, okay? And I was coming into this position where everyone was saying, we don't know if this is gonna work, this is so different, da, da, da. And I'm like, how do I bring these together? And so there's also a piece of, this is the space where I can bring these things together, where the students and the pedagogical goals in Asian American Studies don't require that you have, extensive knowledge of mental health, mental illness, diagnosis, intervention, all of those kinds of things. But you can still do something that affects mental health, right? So I started with this. And we had a tiered research team, so we had like at different times somewhere between 2 and 5 undergraduates, 3 and 5 graduate students, and 1 to 3 faculty. And we did everything from the beginning to the end as a collaborative effort. So we did our literature review together, we read articles together, we tiered reading articles. We didn't read everything together, but we supervised linearly undergraduate students to read articles and to sort and to determine what's really relevant and what's not. We then developed the research questions, we developed the interviews together, and then we conducted the interviews, reviewed the interviews. So it was this kind of collaborative, very messy process. Okay. We interviewed 11 faculty, 10 staff, and 27 Asian American students. And we asked them, we conducted 30 to 60-minute interviews. Some of the students were actually interviewed in classes or through their affiliation with classes. So there was a connection made between the project, their research project, the classes in Asian American Studies, and the impact for the university. So it was talked about in the classes, and it was talked about to the students, and it was talked about to the staff, as this is a way that we can impact the experience of Asian American students on campus. Okay. So we asked people essentially 3 areas. What are their perspectives on the experiences of Asian American students? What are the factors that influence, in their view, that influence the positive or negative experiences for Asian American students? And whether there are needs that aren't being met, and what they are, and how they could be met. Okay. And we found that there were different perspectives, which was not hugely surprising. So I'm like whipping through method, and I'm whipping through results, and if you would like details in any of those, I can point you, I can answer your questions at the end. I can point you to the publications that came out of this. Eventually I can produce statistics, although I can't do that like that. And with this one I can't because it's qualitative. We also found some differences, not surprisingly, between Asian American staff and faculty and non-Asian American staff and faculty in their view of Asian American students. Okay. A lot of times non-Asian American faculty and staff kind of were like, oh, there really isn't an issue, except they self-segregate. Okay. But so there were different viewpoints, but that was good, you know. It was good to see it. So major themes: cultural and racial isolation of Asian and Asian American students, language barriers came up repeatedly, cultural misunderstandings and stereotyping. This was misunderstandings and stereotypings that came from professors and staff about Asian American students. In other words, that the faculty and staff at UMass were not understanding what was going on with Asian American students. And the lack of resources and support. In other words, that students were encountering things that they didn't know how to deal with. Students' perspective was that Asian American students, including themselves, were socially isolated, racially segregated, had negative experiences with advising, and this was like so overwhelming that it wasn't like negative experiences with student support. It was negative experiences with advising. And the faculty were not culturally aware, with the exception of Asian American Studies, which was really interesting, and the importance of Asian American Studies courses and professors. Now, of course, our sampling is skewed, so we're going to get some of this, but this was skewed from places that, I mean, from not only from students in that space, but from our general population interview as well. So, overall, these are our findings.
Karen, do you have the overall demographic of Asian American faculty and students in the university overall?
We have about 6% Asian American students. Our Asian American students overall, our students overall are about 50% people of color. A very high proportion, I think over 50%, first in their family to go to college. UMass is a designated ANAPISI, an Asian American, Native American, Pacific Islander serving institution. And that is based primarily on the Southeast Asian population that we have. So we have a very large number of Southeast Asian, Vietnamese, Cambodian, students relative. And then the Chinese Americans, usually lower SES. And also,
And then faculty.
and then, wait, hold on a second, and students tend to, across the board, not just with Asian American students, speak a language other than English, I think. Like more than, I think, almost 50%, approaching 50% students speak a language other. And the other thing that's really interesting about UMass is that we have a very large black student population, I mean large in terms of minorities, but they're not predominantly, they didn't used to be, African American. So they're Caribbean and African American, which shifts the whole kind of race dialogue piece. The faculty, I don't actually know the numbers, and it varies a lot from school to school and college to college. But mostly East Asian, almost entirely East Asian. I think there's 2 Southeast Asian. Oh wait, I take that. East Asian and South Asian. And there's a split, as there may be here, between Asian Studies and Asian American Studies. So there's a group of Faculty of Asian Heritage and Asian Studies. Does that help? Okay. I'm going to go to the next project. So just preparing. So this actually led to a question about this piece, this what is going on with Asian American courses and how is this working? So, which led to this study, how do Asian American Studies courses affect Asian American college students? And this was a how. So one of the models that UMass Asian American Studies has is a course called Applied Research in Asian American Studies, which is an upper level course. The content and approach to it varies hugely depending on who is teaching it. So I taught it this way. Loan Dao has taught it as a community-based participatory research piece in Southeast Asian communities. Shirley Tang, I think, has taught it as an oral history course. So it is basically a course that enables faculty and students to make these connections that break down the kind of traditional areas, of kind of community service and research and teaching, right? So this was as I said, an upper level small class that asked this question, and we interviewed Asian American students. These were 2 semesters. I taught this 2 semesters. What I'm going to talk about today come from 1 semester. The course focuses on doing way too much, kind of like I'm doing here right now. Okay. So teaching research methods, qualitative, grounded theory research methods, actually doing the research and interviewing, and then analyzing it, producing it, and then presenting it to the university, like overall to the university. And then some of these students went on and actually presented at national level conferences with me. So this is an overview of the actual research. This was our criteria for participants, 18 years or older. They had to identify as Asian or Asian American, and they were enrolled in their first Asian American Studies class. Right? So, because we were kind of interested in, okay, so you haven't, drunk the Kool-Aid yet. I realized that at some point people are not going to get that reference. But we wanted people who were kind of like able to tell us what was happening right now. Okay. So this is the breakdown of our participants. This is pretty typical for the kinds of students that take Asian American Studies classes. It looks like this. And this is pretty typical too. Okay. So this was the slide that actually the students primarily, but the students and I collaboratively created. The reason why, every time I switch a slide background, it means that I'm actually using a different slideshow. So this is the slideshow from the student presentation at the conference. Okay. The Asian American Studies has effects on self, views of education, and views of other Asian Americans. And it does that through things like the content structure, the professor approach, and the classmates. And each of these were detailed more by the students. But just to give you a little, that more traditional qualitative method thing, some interview quotes to illustrate each of these. So in terms of views of self, one of our participants said, "I guess this class makes me feel more important. Because of my race, I am not ashamed. I feel more confident in myself as a person, not just because I'm Filipino, but because of who I am. I like sharing more things about my culture and about who I am." Another participant, in terms of experience of education and motivation, said, "This course requires you to reflect upon your own experience. I feel like regular courses require you to do regular things, and what you do is what you're required to do, and then just reflect on what the teacher said. Asian American Studies is talking about our life. Told by the teachers, it's really about our daily life. It's not about the rich people in academia." And then the views of others, one participant said, "I learned more about how much it takes for a family to survive here. I see my parents in a different light. It really makes me think how they got here. They work hard. You see their sacrifices. I appreciate more. I have more respect for them. I speak to my parents more. I try to learn more, and I try to ask them questions about back home and things like that." Relatedly, one of the graduate students, who's now an alum, who worked with me, did a project that looked at Cambodian American children of refugees, and how and one piece of her study actually talked about how Asian American Studies was a pathway for those students to bridge that generational divide that was created by the trauma. So, really great synergy in those pieces. So, I'm kind of giving you all of the findings, and I'm going to talk about impact all at the end. The students who did this were just fantastic, and I'll share some of their voices with you in a little bit. This project then led to a bigger, kind of more quantitative, oh, you're coming up for tenure, kind of project, which was this one, the impact of Asian American Studies on Asian American student success. So this was a larger, much kind of more ambitious and more traditionally psych kind of study, okay? So the question was, does taking Asian American Studies courses affect Asian American students' mental health or perceived academic ability, either directly or through changes in the perception of racism or the development of Asian American identity? And this was a quantitative, long-term, pre-test, post-test study. Okay, so what that means is that we had a group of students that were enrolled in Asian American Studies and for the very first time, and a group of students who had never taken any Asian American Studies classes. And we surveyed them at the beginning of the semester, and then we surveyed them again at the end of the semester. Okay, so we ended up with about 250 pre-tests, and of that, we had 100 that took both. Okay, about 50 in each group. It took us a long time to get this data because we are a very small program. But this is kind of much more traditional psych data. And you can see, again, it's the same, kind of like, it's a little lower here than we would normally have in terms of Southeast Asian. Than we see in our classes. Okay. And then we looked at statistically the differences between Asian American students and the control group on generation, regional ethnicity, or gender to make sure that those weren't actually splitting across the spaces. Outcome measures, we were interested in anxiety, depression, fear of negative evaluation, social avoidance and distress, and self-esteem. These two we included because the literature suggests that some of the ways that Asian American students and Asian Americans in general are actually at risk is social anxiety and some of the things that relate to kind of being marginalized, but also having really high social antenna, but being around people who don't have really high social antenna and don't send out the same cues that someone in a culturally congruent space might. And then we also looked at a whole bunch of different types of racism, which was one of the strengths of the study. So we looked at race-related stress. So this is a measure by Chris Liang that looks at race-related stress specific for Asian Americans. It's called the Asian American Race-Related Stress Inventory. And it has these 3 subscales in addition to a total scale. And you'll see why that's important a little bit. Colorblind racial attitudes is a structural measure. It's like race doesn't matter. You know, that's typical colorblind kind of thing, right? And then we looked at race-related empowerment, which there's no good measure of this. So we actually modified a measure that has never been published. It was only used with Black African Americans in a dissertation study. So just as a little aside, this is what we're working on right now. We're actually piloting a measure of resisting racism for Asian Americans and other people of color. And then racial and cultural identity. So these are the collective self-esteem, ethnic identity, racial identity. So, results. There were no differences between Asian American Studies students and non-enrollers in the amount of change over the semester in perceived academic ability or mental health. So we thought there would be, and there wasn't. Okay. There were differences in changes related to the perceptions and stress of racism. Students who took Asian American Studies experienced an increase in perception or stress of general racism, socio-historical racism, and total racism. So this measure has a drawback that you can't distinguish what is stress from what is perception. Okay, so the measure has anchors that are like 0, I don't experience that. 1, I experience that a little and it stresses me out a little. 2, 5, I think it's 5, I experience that a lot and it stresses me out a lot. Okay, but it's the and, so you can't pull it apart about what is perception and what is stress. Okay, so I mean, I would say this is not surprising because we spend our semester talking about racism. They're going to see racism more. Okay, but you could say, well, wait a minute. Doesn't that mean you're just making it worse? Okay. Okay. Which was not happening. But let's talk about interactions.
So I was the decrease in the colorblind.
So there's a trend towards a decrease in colorblindness. In other words, students who take Asian American Studies are less likely to endorse colorblind attitudes, which is also that. Yeah, okay, you get it. Race matters. Excellent. Okay, students who take, this is about interactions, which is kind of where the really interesting story is. Students who take Asian American Studies start the classes with more frequent experiences and greater stress related to racism. In other words, they start out being more stressed about racism or seeing racism more, which is probably part of why they take Asian American Studies classes, right? There isn't any difference, however, in how anxious students who take Asian American Studies are versus how anxious students who don't are, okay? So this is a general anxiety measure, okay? But in students who take Asian American Studies, there is a statistically significant correlation between anxiety and socio-historical racism. In other words, being aware that there is a structural aspect, that's what socio-historical racism is, of racism against Asian Americans is consistently related to experiencing more anxiety. Students who take Asian American Studies don't have that relationship anymore. Woo! So there is something, hopefully, about Asian American Studies that enables students, we think, this is how we would interpret it, to understand socio-historical racism post-class as not their fault. Awesome. Okay. So more generally, this is okay. So we had 250. Wow. So which made us look at the relationships between variables in this larger group. This is just the pretest group. Okay. To look at how experiences of racism relate to psychology in general, psychological experience in general, and this is kind of the pattern. So these are positive or negative correlations. This is a presentation from the Anapisi conference where I was talking to a lot of people that don't do stats at all. So I didn't know how many of you did stats. So I'm giving you the non-stats version. If you want to see the correlation table, I can show you that too. But positive and negative basically means positive or negative, right? If there's a positive relationship or a negative relationship. If it's yellow, it is a statistically significant relationship. If it is blue, it is trending. It is a maybe relationship. And if there's a line, it means there wasn't any relationship. Okay. So this is a lot of correlations, and so there's some statistical issues with running this many correlations, of course. So I'm not kind of saying this any one, but I think what's interesting when you do a kind of overview thing like this is to actually look at a pattern, okay? So overall, experiences of racism, here, okay, relate more racism, more mental health issues. Anxiety, depression, fear of negative evaluation, but pretty much in this area, okay? It's also really important to realize that the positive things, like collective self-esteem, which is like how much you identify as Asian American, for instance, or ethnic identity, or aspects, some of the more positive aspects of racial identity, okay, have actually stronger relationships in support, in other words, in decreasing mental health issues than the other way. And so it's kind of like, well, can we make the argument on the other side too, that it does positive things? Okay. So here's a summary of findings. Racism relates to mental health symptoms. And mental health symptoms is related to student success. So that's been pretty well established by the research. Positive racial and cultural identities and a complex understanding of racism as a systemic problem relates to positive mental health and perceived academic ability. Fostering positive racial and ethnic identities, collective self-esteem, and race-related empowerment can contribute to Asian American student success. So, this is that aspect of like, we think about Asian American studies as something that is structural intervention, which it is. But structural intervention also happens through individual shifts and movements. Like, that when we create a collective political movement, it's not like that movement is not made up of actual real individual people that at some point make a decision that they're going to do something to contribute to the better good, right? To social justice. Okay. See, I'm really aiming at being done at 10 of. 4 minutes of like really fast. Okay. I want to talk actually about results and impacts of the program overall. Okay, so we can pick apart any one of these studies, but so there is, of course, the publications and research presentations. We published, I don't know, maybe 4 or 5 articles based on different pieces of this. Disseminated, students, undergraduates, graduates, mixes of undergraduates and graduates have presented at regional and national conferences. We have published about the process as well as the findings. So how do you do this kind of thing? How do you put together a project that tries to do this in its method as well as its findings? Modeling approaches to traditional disciplines that integrate critical race analysis. So this is that piece of like my psych students saying, you are the model that you can do this without selling your soul. Which is kind of like, oh, that's great, yes. You don't have to sell your soul. Well, there is that piece about like if you're going to, like they go to other places and they basically get the message, what is the research area that you're going to get like big money in and become known in? And the only way you can do that is if you shut your door and stop talking to students and stop caring so much and stop putting so much energy into things other than publishing research, right? And that puts people who have an active agenda, it ties them into knots, right? So to a certain extent, just having a different viewpoint is really important. That's why I go on and talk about it all the time. I also have a model on my research team with my graduate students that this kind of data, like the big data collection, where we have a lot of pretest stuff. We have a pay-forward model. So a group of graduate students, like the project we're working on right now, graduate students that have no need for that data are never going to use that data or contributing to that data collection because it's paid forward, so somebody else did it for them. And so theses are from team data, almost exclusively on my team, so you don't have to collect your own data. And dissertations are their independent area, because we require both. Okay. And so it also builds capacity in that way. Results and impacts. So this is some of the students from the qualitative grounded impact of the Asian American students. This is one of the group of one group of students presenting the findings to the university community. So there's a piece about empowering students as researchers, exposing both graduate and undergraduate students to social justice content and approaches, and Asian American studies. And so some of the students who come into these areas are really psych students. They're not interested necessarily, or they don't think they're interested in Asian American studies, but they have their own experiences as Asian American students of oppression. And then they get kind of turned on to the ways that psych doesn't have to be post-positivistic. It doesn't have to be squashing. It doesn't have to be all of these things, and you can make these great connections. So undergraduate students then also across the board learn that you can have an impact, that this is a way that they can actually have a say and change what affects them and affects their community. And then we will talk about how this is a model for what you can do in the broader community, what you can do when you graduate, what you can do in your neighborhood, okay? So that knowledge production becomes something that they can then use for policy and advocacy, as well as for their personal, so that we're not just navel-gazing, essentially. And then addressing the identified areas of exclusion and isolation for Asian American students. So actually, through these presentations, kind of saying, hey, look, we have data at this university. So whenever we do one of these presentations, we invite the provost, and we invite the chancellor, and we invite the student services folks, and get them all to come and say, hey, look, this is what you're missing, okay? Wow. Sorry. It's showing up really weird here, and I'm like, is it showing up really weird here? Through the research, so this is impacts, right? We connect Asian American Studies faculty, staff, and students on campus, right? And so we raise our visibility, but we also make really important, like, social capital connections of being able to say, okay, so this is the person who does advising. Here's the person who will really advise you well, okay? Here's the person to go speak to if you have a problem with such and such, because we kind of get familiar with them, and so then we spread the word in that way. There's this increased recognition of the needs of Asian American students. And so because we then report back to the faculty that we've interviewed, for instance, they actually have the same information we have, okay? So you can sit in a meeting, as actually I did, having done this. I'm sitting in a, what is it? What was it? It was like a 5-year plan, master plan meeting, okay? And somebody is talking about how advising is such a huge thing. And I said, well, my data suggests that advising is kind of racist. And it was like I dropped a big bomb. Okay. So what happens next, right? I mean, I got to give it a lot of credit to my university. What happens next is that advising says, come and do a training for us.
Come and what?
Come and do a training for us about how to better advise Asian American students, right? And then we tackle the issue of, like, they're telling the Asian American students not to take classes that require writing. Like, no, don't do that. Okay, well, you have to figure out a different way to talk about this and different assumptions that we can bring to this and these kinds of things. And then the Anapisi grant. So UMass was recognized as an Anapisi, and then because we have the designation, we can put in a grant to get funding. And part of what was in that grant was the fact that we had a needs assessment and that we had been doing these different things that were related to some of these projects. And we got the grant, multi-year grant that is providing student services, and that then also funded faculty seminars, student support seminars, seminars for admissions, for outreach to the community, so that admissions officers would understand the ways that applicants were interacting and not, tell them that they should do what they want and not what their family wants and those kinds of things. Personally, there's this connection of Asian American studies and psychology, so yes, it can work. Changes in psychology and in the doctoral program in psychology, I am incredibly blessed because psych has been a place that has been actively wanting to be affected by what I do. And so it has shifted the program was always on a mission, always had a mission to serve underserved populations, but now I would say we actually have a social justice mission. And this whole aspect of mental health and holistic engagement with Asian American students and Asian American studies. Thank you. 25 minutes for questions, and hope you have a bunch. And if you don't, I can talk about classes. Because there are ways in which a lot of these pieces also can then get translated into regular classroom kind of approaches.
I have a question, Karen. I know that you did this in Boston, and there's only a 6% percentage of Asian American students in your area. What would you predict about the findings that you had in a context like the University of Hawaii, where we have 60% API populations and the minorities are Pacific Islanders? Would you expect the same mediating and moderating factors to occur in people who didn't take Asian American studies and then taking it and seeing how the effects would either be the same, different, or lower? I mean, what would you predict in terms of the different cultural environment?
Oh, Bobby, what a setup.
I'm a psychologist too, so. Well, I'm just wanting to brainstorm about how the context influences some of the mediating and moderating factors and its effect on mental health.
So I think the context is huge. So, here my understanding is you don't have Asian American studies, you have ethnic studies. And that is a strength, I think, in many ways. And I think it's different. There are ways in which I think it's probably a strength, and there are ways in which I think it's probably a drawback, right? For us, it would be a bigger drawback, I think, because the context is one that has, because there are complicated personalities and histories on the mainland about race relations, not that there aren't here, and particularly in our university. So I don't know what's on your university, but that's
Different races.
Oh, I think, so I don't know, because I don't know this context, okay? So now I'm going to take, having said that, I'm going to take that flying psychologist, whoa, let me just expound, right? I can't imagine that it would be similar in some ways, because I think the racialization process for Asian Americans here is really radically different. Right. My own personal experience here is that there's still a power hierarchy, where Asian Americans are not on top, but that there's a difference between cultural privilege and an economic or status privilege. Who gets to have the most power, say, the most influence in some ways, and that those aren't, on the mainland, my experience is that those are wedded really tightly together, that white people are both, okay, and that may not be as true here, that those two things are totally together, because the cultural privileges seems very different here, but that's me coming in from the outside and looking and saying, this is kind of my experience, Given that I don't know how much the experience of racism is present, whether some of the things that are taught about understanding mainland racism against Asian Americans would make sense here. And particularly the measures that are being used, I think may not make sense here. Because you're not, even if you're experiencing anti-Asian discrimination, it's probably not going to look the same as it looks on the mainland. So I think context is huge, I actually have reviewed for you, Bob.
Yes.
Articles when you were action editor
Yes.
that were using mainland Asian American measure stuff in Hawaii, and I was like, I don't see how this is gonna, you're not talking about how this is similar or different enough to actually be able to draw the conclusion.
I mean, I didn't mean to ask you to predict anything, but in my experience, when I was an undergraduate here on campus, because I'm from here, but I went away to live for a long, long time and then came back recently. I grew up as a psychology student. We didn't even think about the impact of Asian American issues in the psychology training, except for some cultural issues, from cross-cultural issues and things. And then when I went to graduate school in the mainland, it was a whole different mindset, because instead of being the majority here, we're the small minority. And the graduate school I went to, I was the only Asian American student in my whole program. So it's a sort of total revision. But my awakening as an Asian American psychologist came when I had major conversations with people who grew up in LA. So in that process of learning about what it means to be an Asian American person, evolved from those conversations.
Yeah, I mean, one of the other things that I've been writing about is about the positionality of the researcher.
Mm-hmm.
So I think that that's another piece of context, is that how do you learn that and understand it? I mean, I was born in Boston and raised in that area, and then lived in other places, and then returned back to Boston. And you know, I think I've said this to some of you in this room, that in Boston, particularly being Hapa, is like, you know, my entire experience of being Asian American was, what the hell are you doing here? You're not Asian, right? So, you know, that's a very different experience than here, right? And so my lens of which I see kind of oppression and how Asian oppression works, and my connection to the community is very different, right? And that affects the work that I do and how and why I do it as well.
So thanks, Karen, for this informative presentation. Just wondering, you said like you would invite the provost and whoever else to this outcome, you know, to talk about these outcomes. Did it make any difference in terms of increasing resources to your program, you know, and the rest of it, without me going into detail?
Yes and no. Like directly, like money, no. Like goodwill and a certain amount of self-determination and kind of being, and like being able to advocate for student needs, being able to advocate for a line, so I guess that's money. Yeah, yes.
So you got some in your position?
Yeah, I mean, I wouldn't say from this work alone, but from a variety of things where we work to raise visibility and kind of be present structurally, and to make the connections to student services in really direct, like pushy, kind of ways. I mean, you know, as much as Asian Americans are.
Yeah, one follow-up question about the person when you were being interviewed for the job. Did that make a difference to that person? I mean, your work.
He says to me now, I didn't think you were going to make it work, and you really did. You know, yeah, so.
I'm curious how the training with advising went and whether it actually shifted the kinds of practices and interactions with students.
I've done a couple of trainings. So I did that very first training, and then I did trainings through Anapisi with advising. I think yes. I mean, we haven't done a follow-up study because we actually never looked at advising quantitatively, so it was a qualitative result. So we don't know whether it was a widespread. You know, it's always kind of an interesting thing, because I tend to be of the, if one student is experiencing something really bad, shouldn't you be concerned about it? You know, why do you need to show that this is like the average experience? Like, if it's the average experience, then it really sucks. But, sorry, I'm not supposed to say that. But I have heard from students and also from other advisors that it got better. So there was like an Asian American advisor, and so she would say, oh, afterward, like she would say, oh, I'm so glad you came and did that. You know, so there's a piece of it that's like this indirect effect, because it makes her life easier. Because rather than being that lone voice that nobody listens to, she can say, oh, remember we had that training? And they said, you know, maybe we should, those kinds of things. And so, like, you know, do I have data for it? No, but my impression is that it was helpful. But then UMass changed its whole advising structure. So, yeah.
I have two quick questions. The first one just about the empowering students as researchers piece. I'm curious, did you also use the IRB process as a teaching tool for them? So I haven't ever taught like a research design class, but I mentor like individual students. And I personally found that taking them through the IRB process and having them do that not only helps them understand research as a profession, but also to sort of get their heads around the sort of ethical trappings of research and the idea of research subjects versus actual individuals and that sort of thing. So I'm curious about how you integrated IRB into your process. And then the second question about the overall findings of the studies.
Wait, can we do
Sure.
one- can we do one at a time? Sorry, I can only hold two.
Sure.
So I also teach qualitative methods at the doctoral level, and so I have taught, and do this kind of with psych students. And the project we did there was a project on a qualitative graduate project on being and becoming an ally. So what inspires people to come to work against, say, racism when they're white, for example. But I mean, IRB is yes, sometimes. So with some of the students, yes. It's very hard to do in one semester
Yeah.
because
That's
you
right.
kind of have to set IRB up ahead of time, but you can take them through IRB. IRB is hard because it's complicated in multiple ways, because oral history doesn't always fall under that purview. Work that is for the university doesn't always fall under that purview. There are some really important ethical pieces in history about IRB that really needs to be included, but then there are also ways in which IRB then keeps certain kinds of voices out, or keeps certain kinds of methods from being allowed, and also, so it's complicated.
Yeah, perfect instructional tool.
Yes, and so if you have the time, it's a perfect
Yeah.
instructional tool.
Yeah.
So.
My second question, thanks very much. I was hoping that you could say, we do that in class and we found a way to do it in a semester because I cannot figure out a way to integrate it into it because of all of those things that you said. And
So we
it's
talk
excellent
about
question.
IRB, but don't necessarily bring them through it.
Got it. The second question is actually about the findings. And so specifically with the pre-post test, the more quantitative study that you had. So you found these interesting effects, but you weren't able to empirically test mechanisms. And so I'm just curious what you think those mechanisms are. I suspect that some of the findings from your qualitative work breathes life into what the possible mechanisms are.
Yes.
And I mean, in my head I was just sort of thinking there's either like an instructional effect, or there's some sort of like community drawing people all together with the same issues sort of effect, or there's something correlated that all of these folks in these Asian American studies classes also do something else that's unmeasured, that's accounting for this. So what do you think?
The latter, I would hope, would be accounted for by a control group and by the fact that we use residual gain scores and not simple difference scores. Sorry.
Right, it's not a difference, not a simple difference in difference.
It's not a simple difference score, it's a residual gain.
Right.
So which accounts for the variability. Sorry for those of you who are not stats geeks, which accounts for the different variability in start points between the two groups. So, so I would hope that the last piece that you
Right.
said would be just randomly distributed. Maybe not, but
Right, and without seeing your research design, I think that's viable, but you also said that these groups are also highly self-segregated, or like, at least that's other people's perceptions of them, so it's
No, that-
possible
it's-
that there might be some unreported
Asian Americans
thing.
are self-segregated, not
Right.
Asian American studies students.
Okay,
Okay. And that's really important because I think that sometimes there is a perception that students who are not more likely to take Asian American studies are more segregated. But that's a separate aside. Certainly there may be a difference between the groups that is untested and another variable that doesn't come in, into our design. Sure. I think that there are certain kinds of things like community building, like fostering relationships with the professors, breaking down some of the isolation. I think there's a piece about unity, actually. So one of the things that is interesting is this idea that students who take Asian American Studies are already more attuned to racism. And that at that time, that particular kind of racism is related to, so socio-historical racism is related to anxiety.
So it's a selection issue.
Right. So there's a selection issue, but then there's an effect issue that comes with that selection issue. So, and there's actually that connection in students generally. And so what is it that Asian American Studies does that allows you to see his socio-historical racism even more than you did to begin with, even when it was higher than the folks who were not, but still somehow no longer have it be related to your anxiety, right? And I think some of that is actually content. So I think some of that is, this relates actually to some work that we did with the pretest scores that looked at whether, that looked at colorblind racism as structural racism and the RC as interpersonal racism, and looked at the difference between personal self-esteem and collective self-esteem, because there's a hypothesis, particularly in counseling psych, that that it helps one's mental health to help people, has mental health benefits to help people understand that racism is structural. In other words, that there's a good thing to understanding that, to depersonalizing and saying, this isn't about me. Like, if I walk down the street and somebody calls me a chink, as opposed to saying, oh, I'm so ashamed that I'm Asian, I can say, wow, that person really has a problem. Okay, so you depersonalize it. And in that, we actually found that there were differences between the kinds of structural racism and collective self-esteem, and that the patterns of relationship were different, such that individual, like interpersonal racism, had a bigger effect on, I remember this, on individual self-esteem, and that collective, the colorblind racism was different. And so I think there is a piece about the content or the pedagogy depersonalizing racism in a way that makes you say, this isn't my problem. And so I don't have to be anxious about it. I can be anxious about a lot of other things.
No. I'll let you go because I'm sort of the facilitator.
All right. First of all, thanks, Karen. It was a really great talk and gives us a lot to think about in a lot of different ways. Going back maybe to the initial question about thinking about the situation here, and also in relation to the context of Hawaii, here there's been a tremendous amount of research and critique recently of not only understanding those structures of racism, which have targeted Asian Americans, but also differently, in different groups of Asian Americans differently, and also the implication of Asian Americans within structures of colonialism.
Yeah.
Right. And so I was curious to hear your view on how discussions of colonialism also do or do not make it into the kind of discussions of racism, and also the ways in which the concern with whether or not Pacific Islanders should be aggregated with Asian Americans, and how completely different histories, such as Native Hawaiian histories and experiences of colonialism, get erased with the AAPI, and that's how those categories got. There was an effort to disaggregate them, but then they still come back together in different ways. How that discussion informs or is brought up at all in the context of this research?
Not explicitly in the context of this research. I mean, we do talk about colonialism in like the Asian American Studies classes. I feel like it's more a question about how Asian American Studies is at UMass than it's about the research, because that's not necessarily something that would tap in the research. Like Pacific Islanders is like we're an Anapisi, but we're really an Anap. And we're an like there's no like the Pacific Islander population at UMass Boston is like you know. So, and yet, like for instance, when I teach Intro to Asian American Studies, Ping An comes and talks about, you know, the hole in the donut and Pacific Islanders, and so it's, and you know, it's kind of like Rajni has talked, I don't know, most of you probably know Rajni. 'Cause she was Rajni Shrikant came and talked about the AAAS hoo-ha about I'm going to forget the author who wrote it, and it was kind of anti-Filipino, and you know, you all know, probably know better what I'm talking about than I do in terms of names, because I'm terrible with names. And so I think some of those issues, I mean, I know in my classes I take up those issues, like that's just one example. In Asian American Psych, we talk about Filipino colonialism and the ways, and we also talk about, in general, a big thing in my work, probably because of my positionality as a Hapa, having been brought up in Boston, is who's on the margin of the margin. Right? So kind of a critique of the ways that Asian Americans are not a unified group, and that we as a group marginalize other groups. So we marginalize Filipinos, or we marginalize, in Boston, Southeast Asian is a big marginalization, or we marginalize, you know, multiracial people, Korean adoptees. So it's a lot of the other research that comes out of my team. I'm really a generalist. So when people say, you know, choose that area, get really famous in it, yeah, I just never managed to do that. It's related to those things. So I think, for me, that's part of what is, I learned so much about here, because it breaks down, like, you know, some of the same systems and structures and interpersonal stuff. Ula and I were talking about, you know, discriminations between different Pacific Islanders and stereotypical views, and like how do you talk about that? How do you recognize that you might have some privilege that somebody else might not have? And that's the same, like, psychologically, it's the same process in a different context with a different power structure. So I think that there are pieces that really the psych pieces, the process psych, in my view, pieces transfer actually pretty well. And that's one of the things that makes me excited about kind of bringing the things together. Personally, so I don't know if I'm supposed to say this, but personally, I don't think Pacific Islanders should be part of Asian Americans. Like, I think the culture is different. I think the history is different. I think, you know, issues of sovereignty and colonial. I mean, this is not. It doesn't. Personally, I don't know what the PC answer to that is, so I'm sorry if I just gave a really un-PC answer. but I don't, you know, I think it's, what I hear is much more commonality with Native American sovereignty issues.
I mean, I ask because I think there's a lot of really important implications for, you know, the kinds of work you've been doing, both in terms of showing the administration that, you know, don't cut ethnic studies, and in fact, you know, keep us around because they're doing something that's important, but also how we can, again, think of how this kind of collaborative research that also produces kinds of results that are legible to administrators and funders can be retooled for our situation in you know, all the ways we're talking about right now. So I just wanted to.
I mean, I think there's a foundational piece about, like, that multicultural education benefits everyone. And so Asian American Studies benefits Asian American students, and we can talk about that, but also, you know, this other piece, like the Ally projects that I've been working on and stuff, is like, how does this kind of education really impact all students in positive ways? Like, what is the drawback of the structures of oppression and marginalization for all people? Right? You know, and you have to balance it, like, you know, in my program, we've had some pretty interesting conversations about, like, if you only have so much capacity as a professor, right? Do you put your capacity into this Asian American students because they're marginalized and they don't have, you know, or do you put your capacity into, say, the white students that are going to go out and teach the Asian American students or treat the Asian American students, or, you know, and that need to have what I think about as kind of working from within, you know, the marginalized group, and then working from within, like, the center or the margin of the center to pull and push. So I think that there's that piece as well. you know. At the same time, I think that Hawaii is not a closed community. People leave here. And so I think, as Bobby was saying, you know, if you don't prepare Asian American students, like if the whole focus is on, say, Pacific Islanders as the marginalized people, because that is true here in this context, but it's not placed in a larger context of the nation or the world, then, you know, you're going to have Asian Americans that leave Hawaii, and they're not going to be able to figure out what's happening. And that is actually going to, you know, be damaging in a whole variety of kinds of ways. So I think that there's that larger, how do you make those connections, right?
It's, I think, 4:16, but maybe one last question. Oh, there was a question here.
Okay. No, you go ahead.
Is there a question for anyone who has not asked a question? Okay. So then you guys can do good.
No, you go.
Actually, we
I'll
could
talk
just
to you later.
open it up. I mean,
Yeah,
I mean, if
just
you want to
open
just,
it up
I mean,
and-
if you want to just end, and then we can just have more informal, and the formal part now, and then just have
Yeah,
more
so maybe we
informal.
should end the formal part now, and then Karen will talk to us and address our questions.
Thank you so much.
Yeah, thank you.